Hello friends, to be informed about the new coming videos, you can support me by subscribing to my channel and liking my videos. Enjoy listening. I want to tell you about the most helpless moment I experienced in my life. I woke up to a beautiful day's morning with the crying sound of my little sister Darren. I guess my mom wasn't in her bed because Darren's crying sound didn't seem to stop. I got out of bed and came to my mom's room. The door was open and Darren was crying there. I went to her and tried to calm her down first, but I couldn't. She was probably hungry. I took her in my arms and left the room. I called out for Mom, but there was no one in the house. Darren's voice had now become unbearable. While holding one of her arms, I was trying to prepare her food with one hand. Just then, the landline phone started ringing. On one hand the sound of the phone, on the other hand Darren's voice, and on the other hand the food I was trying to prepare with one hand. I had started to get angry when my mom entered through the door. I handed Darren to her. "Why do you leave this child alone and go? I couldn't even get to the ringing phone," I said. My mom said to me, "My girl, I went to the neighbor for 2 minutes. I called you when I was leaving. You were obviously awake. It's best I'll prepare breakfast for you." And she went to the kitchen. I went back to my room. Even if my mom sometimes gets angry with me, my dad always protects me, defending me, saying, "No one can say anything to my beautiful daughter." My mom is very attached to her family. She works very hard to fulfill all our wishes and to make us happy. My dad is also just like my mom, attached to his family. Until now, I have never heard them shout at each other. You will understand why I told these as the story progresses. The name of our village is Makim Village, a self-contained place but very close to holiday roads, a perfect place. Moreover, another source of income for those in our village is tourism. Either they rent their houses or their gardens. Some young people work in hotels. They do iron and steel. Our village was like a corner of paradise with its quietness. Our village, filled with gentle people. Everyone respects each other. They support each other on good and bad days. The people of our village are really helpful. However, sometimes every beautiful story has a bad end. My grandfather owns a few houses in this village. These houses have been rented for a long time. But my grandfather does not knock on their doors every month and ask for the rent. He says if they have the power to pay it. Sometimes my dad gets angry at this and scolds, but my grandfather says, "Son, not everything is about money." One afternoon, our door rang. It was the village headman Mehmet uncle who came. When my grandfather saw him, he said, "Welcome, come in." But Mehmet uncle was not alone. There was a young couple in their 30s with him. Mehmet uncle said to my grandfather, "Oh, look, brother, do you have a vacant house? This young couple are my relatives. I want to host them here for a while. Is it possible?" My grandfather said, "Are we going to talk at the door? Please let's talk inside," and took a few steps back to show them the way. Mehmet uncle and the guests entered and sat in the living room. My grandfather said, "Welcome," and introduced my mom. "This is my daughter-in-law Yasmin," then pointed at me. "My eldest grandchild Dirya, and I have a little grandchild Darren, who will turn 1 next month. She is a very naughty girl," he said with a smile. Mehmet uncle introduced the couple. "This is my uncle's grandson Tahir Bey and his fiancée AJ. They will have their wedding soon, God willing. They have been working in Germany for a long time. They came here both for vacation and to visit relatives." For a while they said, "Let them be guests in your house, let them have their holidays." Now you know, one house over another wouldn't work. Which relative should I go to? They will stay for days. "This method is the best, I thought," they said. My grandfather said, "I understand, it's not a problem, let them have their holidays. We have a vacant house, let them move in. You must have told them about our village, the young people will place them there right away, and we will do what we can." Tahir, like everyone else, was smiling, hospitable, and said, "Hopefully, we will be here every year." Smiling. In response I said, "Of course, everyone here is helpful. I am sure you will love it here. My mother brought the coffees and served them. After a bit of chat and conversation, Uncle Mehmet said, "But look bro, let's see that house before it gets late. Later the children can come and settle down. It's furnished, isn't it?" My grandfather said, "Yes, it's furnished." "Sure, let's go," and stood up and left the house with the guests. My mother hoped he would give a fair price, otherwise my father would be very angry with him, she said. In the evening, when my father came home from work, my grandfather told him that he had found a new tenant for the house and rented it at a very good price. When my father heard this, he initially didn't believe it. Then my grandfather took out the money he received from them today from his pocket and showed it, saying, "You can see, I took 2 months in advance." My father said, "Thank goodness, Dad, we finally agreed on something." We were glad there was no problem in this regard. My grandfather asked us to visit our guests who had just come to our village from time to time and even to invite them to our house as guests so that people wouldn't feel alienated. After all, they were new and trying to get used to it, he said. A week later, my mother said, "My daughter, help me make some cookies and let's go to the new tenants. Also, let's ask if they have any needs or problems." I don't usually work in the kitchen, but I love cookies, so I agreed to help my mother. As soon as the cookies were baked, I couldn't resist and ate one right away. My mother knows this cookie-making business well. After preparing a plate, as we were leaving, I thought I saw someone watching me from behind the curtain in the window, or so I thought. I didn't really care. On the way, I saw my friend Buse. After a bit of chat and conversation, I realized I was late getting home. I hurriedly walked home, distancing myself from my friend. I thought my mother would be angry because I was late, but I met my father at the door. When he asked where I came from, he excitedly asked if I had delivered the cookies, but I said I hadn't even opened the door. Entering the house with my father was a chance for me. My mother didn't say anything to me while he was there. As soon as I entered the house, I went to my room. A few minutes later, my room door opened and my mother came in. I wanted to immediately give the right explanation while I was in my place, but I noticed that my mother was acting a bit strange. When I asked what happened, my mother sat on my bed. Layla's sister was pregnant again after the baby. I wondered if there was a problem between them. Anyway, since it was not a situation that concerned me, I returned to my room without my mother noticing. That evening, when my father came, my mother said, "We need to talk," and took him to the kitchen. They talked for a while and came back. We were watching TV with my grandfather. My father said, "My daughter, take your sibling and go to the room. We will talk for a while," and sent me to the room. I was very curious. What could this mysterious topic be? I took my sibling to the room. Just as I was going to listen to my parents, my phone rang. It was my friend calling. She said she was a bit upset and wanted to talk. She distracted me. After talking about silly things with her, I realized it was late. Darren had already fallen asleep on her own. Now, since I was also tired, I fell asleep in my parents' bed. When I woke up in the morning, Darren was not at her bedside. No one had woken me up to go to my own bed. In the evening, Musa must have tired me enough talking about family problems, because I wasn't aware of the people coming in and out of the room. When I got up and came to the living room, I saw my mother sitting on the couch in the living room, watching the TV that was not on. I quietly called out, "Mom," but she didn't hear. I took a few more steps closer and called out, "Mom," again. When my mother saw me, she broke down. I asked her if she was okay, and she brushed it off saying, "I'm fine, it's nothing." I was going to the kitchen to grab something to eat. I opened the fridge, but my mother hadn't prepared anything. I made myself a sandwich and sat down to eat. My mother came to the kitchen saying, "I am going out, your sibling is your responsibility," and quickly left. I followed her out. Looking through the window, I saw her walking briskly with 2 women. One of them looked like Layla's sister, but I couldn't recognize the other. In a few hours, Darren and I were left alone at home. Taking care of a child was really a tough job. We were sitting in the living room. Darren was playing with the toys I gave her. Suddenly I felt as if someone was watching me from behind. I slowly put down the phone and turned around. There was no one. Just as I picked up the phone, there was a noise in the kitchen. I stood up and headed towards the kitchen door. It looked quite calm inside. While carefully checking the surroundings, suddenly I heard Darren screaming. At that moment, it felt as if something inside me fell to the ground. I ran to my sibling, picked her up. She was screaming breathlessly and wouldn't stop. I tried to calm her down but couldn't. I wondered if a bug bit her or if something happened to her, but I had no time to find out. I quickly took her to the bathroom and washed her face and hands. Even though I did everything I could to help her breathe, it was too late. She stopped screaming, her face turned pale and she closed her eyes, becoming motionless in my arms. Her voice was completely gone. My heart was pounding as if it was going to come out, my knees were shaking. I wanted to put her on the couch quickly and run outside to get help. I opened the door and met my father. Seeing me in that state, he said, "My girl, what is this? You are pale, are you okay?" touching my face. I stuttered, "Dad, Darren, something happened to Darren, she can't breathe." My father panicked at that moment and quickly entered inside. I closed the door and followed him into the living room, where I saw my father kneeling beside Darren, who was still playing with her toys. Seeing this, I couldn't swallow. My father said, "Is this some kind of joke?" I couldn't answer. My mother entered through the door. My father asked her, "Where were you at this hour?" She said, "Layla had pains." She said, "I am a bit tired, I am going to sleep," and went to her room. That night everyone stayed with their mother. We never sat at the table without our mother. We always ate the meals she prepared. We always drank the tea she made. Now my mother had gone to sleep. Even when she was sick, she would think of us and not leave us without food. There was nothing to do. My father and I went to the kitchen and prepared something. My grandfather would always come home after praying at the mosque when the call to prayer was heard. My father and I prepared something good and bad as much as we could and put it on the table. That night we had our fill. After this exhausting and somewhat strange day, sleeping and resting was the best thing. But there was something we didn't know, these were our better days. A few days had passed since that day. One afternoon, suddenly all the electricity in the village was cut off. This normally wouldn't happen. It was a very rare situation, and it would be short. However, this darkness was another darkness. When I looked out of the window, there was no one on the street. Everywhere seemed trapped in a silent and deep darkness. Silence prevailed in our house too. No one was in the mood to talk. This silence was broken by a scream that was quite disturbing and not too far away, a sound that made one's hair stand on end. With this sound, everyone went out to the street, including us. While trying to understand exactly where it came from, suddenly the sound stopped. Everyone on the street was looking at each other. There was a confused expression on everyone's face, an uncertainty, an indecision. At that moment a harsh wind blew. Everyone was staring at one point, following that wind, as if there was something in the wind that no one saw but felt. Everyone was watching it. The moonlight was shedding a little light on the street. A few seconds later, people slowly started to enter their homes. No one said a single word. They didn't ask each other anything. Everyone was strange as if. We also went home. My mother brought a few candles from the kitchen and lit them. Still, no one had said a single word. We were sitting in the candlelight, as if waiting for something to happen or waiting for news from someone. That night was a very long night. Time wasn't passing. We went to bed early and slept. When I woke up in the morning, we sat down to have breakfast. There seemed to be a coldness between my mother and father. I said to my mother, "Mom, shall we go to AJ's sister today?" We can take the cookie plate and ask how she is. But after she angrily placed the tea glass in front of me, she was very angry. My father replied to my mother angrily. Watch your language a bit. My mother said, I wasn't talking to you. My father got up from where he was sitting and went right up to my mother and said, Look, don't exceed my patience, don't make up nonsense and confuse the child's mind. And then left the house. After my father left, my mother really lost her humanity. She broke and smashed everything in the kitchen. I couldn't stop her even if I tried. To prevent my sibling from getting scared, I took her and went to this room. I had never seen my mother like this before. That day we were waiting for my grandfather and father at the table. My mother was sitting furiously, breathing fast. A few minutes later the door rang. My mother said to check the door. When I got to the door, I experienced the feeling I had a few days ago again. When I opened the door and looked, there was no one. When I turned back inside, there was someone tall with hair covering their face behind my mother. I started trembling with fear because what I saw was neither something that could be explained nor something that could be remembered. I raised my head and looked at the clock hanging on the wall. It was almost 11. I slowly sat down where I was, feeling as if I was in a nightmare. Before I could come to myself, the door rang harshly. When my mother got up and opened the door, my father entered quickly and hurriedly, running into his room, his clothes covered in blood. My mother followed him asking, What happened to you? My father said, Very bad things happened. The whole village has lost their minds. My mother said, Don't exaggerate, tell me what happened. My father said, Layla stabbed Layla, then threw it towards the baby in the street. When the neighbors saw this, they immediately called an ambulance. They tried to enter the house, but unfortunately Arda had passed away before they arrived. Layla is nowhere to be found. Everyone is looking for her. My mother got angry and said, Are you telling this or are you dreaming? Did you drink alcohol? My father shouted, Look, do I look drunk to you? My mother said, If Layla gave birth, where could she have gone? As my father changed his clothes and left the house, he said, Don't go out of the house. The villagers searched for Layla's sister until morning. She was found dead in the cemetery in the morning. As we were thinking of getting over this incident, we couldn't predict what would happen to us next. My father came home tired. The woman went crazy, he said. She took her own life, her child's life, and her husband's life. When the soldiers found her, she had no eyes and tongue, he said. She buried herself, the bloody knife was in her hand. Whatever she did it herself, he said. After this sentence, there was silence. From that day on, the village became a completely different place. Every day there was noise of fighting coming from a house. The same things were happening in our house. The village had turned into hell all of a sudden. Again, one evening, my mother and father started fighting for no reason. My grandfather said to my father, My daughter, what has happened to you? I have never seen you this resentful towards each other in all these years. If there is a topic you can't agree on, try to resolve it. Don't do this in front of the children. Suddenly, something we never expected happened. My mother cursed my father very harshly. Everyone paused for a moment. When my father heard this, he couldn't control himself and grabbed my mother by the throat. He was almost going to kill her. My grandfather tried to stop him, but my father was enraged. I clung to my father's legs. I begged him not to do it. He let go. He picked me up from the ground and hugged me. Okay, don't cry, my girl, don't be afraid. He tried to console me, but I knew how hard it was for him. My father and I went to my room and talked for a while. He couldn't hold back and cried with me. I want you to sleep with me tonight, Dad, I said. I made room for him in the bed. He lay down next to me and hugged me. It had been a long time. I felt quite safe as I closed my eyes. I wanted to have a good sleep. The most comfortable and safe place for a girl is next to her father. Suddenly at night, I woke up to a clicking sound. My father was not beside me. I got up from the bed trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the door. Someone was knocking on my door. I got up and went towards the door, turned on the room light, first looked around, and then opened the door. There was no one. I closed the door and was going back to my bed when the door was knocked again. I opened the door and looked again. There was no one. This time, I left the door open, turned off the light, and went to my bed. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I could see the surroundings a little. I was looking at the door without blinking when there was another clicking sound. My door was open. How could this be, I thought. When there was a louder click this time, I realized that the sound was not coming from the door but from the wardrobe in my room. My heart was pounding as if it was going to come out of my chest. My hands and feet were freezing. Before doing anything, I was waiting for the real sound from the wardrobe again when the wardrobe door slowly opened with a creak. As if a light breeze passed by, suddenly whispers started coming from the room. I started crying. "Dad, where are you?" At one point, I felt someone standing at my feet. I immediately pulled my legs towards me. My fear was increasing. There were multiple presences in the room. I could tell from the footsteps and whispers. I was praying to God for this nightmare to end when all the whispers and footsteps stopped with my mother's voice. I looked around. There was no one. I was just about to stretch my legs when someone from the darkness grabbed my throat. I couldn't see them. I could only feel their hands burning like fire. I tried to scream but couldn't. As I was trying to get away from that hand, I heard my father's voice. "What are you doing here, my girl?" When I came to my senses, trying to understand what really happened, I realized that I was in the middle of my room and actually the hands choking me were my own hands. My father came to me and took me to my bed, stroked my hair, and said everything will be fine, don't worry. The next day we sat down for breakfast. No one was talking. As usual, my father and grandfather left the house and went away. My mother fed my sibling and went to her room. I didn't know what to do all alone in the big house. I was not used to seeing my family like this. I spent some time with my sibling and then put them in the crib. I went to my room to read a book. While reading the book, I fell asleep. Suddenly, I woke up startled to my mother's voice. Buse was waiting for me at the door. She said it was urgent. Half awake, half asleep, I went to the door immediately. When I asked what happened to my sibling, she told me that I needed to go somewhere urgently. Even though I said my mother wouldn't allow it, she literally dragged me by holding my arm, not even allowing me to put on my shoes. It didn't go as I expected. When I arrived at the front of my house, it was sealed like the other houses in our neighborhood. I screamed alone in the middle of the street. In response to this scream, those disgusting-looking things on the roofs of the opposite houses started laughing and stoning me. Suddenly, I felt someone hold me and shake me saying, "Come to yourself, wake up!" When I opened my eyes, I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. My mother was trying to wake me up. Although I was glad that what I saw was a nightmare, this did not last long. It had already gotten dark, it was night, and even though my mother called me to the dinner table, I refused to eat. I was lying in my bed trying to perceive the events of life. Even though I wanted to explain this situation to my family, I knew they were not in the right state to listen to it right now. So I just said, I wanted to tell. I left my room and came to the living room. I saw that the house door was open. Who could have left the door wide open and gone somewhere? When I went to the front of the door, my mother was standing at the door holding my sibling, looking outside after my father. I heard a gunshot. The sounds came from my uncle's house. Everyone started running towards my uncle's house. The villagers were gathering around the house. The house started to catch fire spontaneously. As people tried to extinguish it, the flames rose even higher. The screams rising from inside the house were creating horror in everyone. My uncle, his daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren lived in that house. He had lost his son in a traffic accident last year. His pain had not yet subsided. From that day on, incessant murders, fires breaking out in houses, women and children disappearing spontaneously, and strange events began to happen. This village was no longer a livable village. One evening, my grandfather came home and said, "Get ready, we're leaving," while trying to hastily get us out of the house. But my mother wasn't listening. She was doing what she knew. My grandfather got angry at her, saying, "How did you become like this? Come on, get ready, we're leaving," and went to his room. As my mother went to the kitchen to take a big knife and wanted to follow him, I tried to stop her but couldn't. She was so strong that she threw me quite far away with a single move. A few seconds later, I heard my grandfather's painful voice ringing in my ears. He was screaming in pain. "What have you done, woman?" When I realized that my mother was no longer herself, I ran out of the house. It was about to get dark. I threw myself into the street and was frantically looking around for someone to help. I thought of our neighbor. I ran to them. Their doors were wide open. Despite calling out several times, no one answered. I didn't know where else to go. I had forgotten my phone at home. I immediately went to my friend Buse's house. I came to the front of the house with fast steps without stopping. I knocked on their door as if to break it. No one opened. But I had no intention of leaving either. After a while, I heard a voice. Someone seemed to be calling me. I looked around, but there was no one. As I walked around the house, I saw Buse waving at me from the window and calling me with a very soft voice tone. I approached the window, asked her why she didn't open the door. She was saying, "Get out of here right now! I don't know where to go, what to do," I said when she practically kicked me out, saying, "Go to Aunt Fatma, be quick!" What does Aunt Fatma have to do with it? Why should I go to her? She didn't even allow me to ask. So I ran to where Buse told me to go. Aunt Fatma was the only midwife in the village. When my mother was pregnant with Darren, she had a lot of pain one evening. We were very afraid that she would give birth prematurely. We thought we might not be able to get to the hospital at that hour, and we took her to that woman's house. Although I saw her occasionally in the village, it was the first time I had seen her so closely and met her. I entered Aunt Fatma's garden, ran to the door and started knocking. Although a bit late, the woman opened the door. "I don't know why I came here. My friend told me I needed to come here," I said. "Everyone has gone mad," I added. She said that the culprit behind these events was your mother and a few other women in the village. It was their choice and nothing can change that. She told me to talk to AJ if I wanted to discuss anything. I fell to the woman's feet and begged her to help me. She was resisting to tell, but I was as stubborn as she was. She lifted me up and said, "I can't change what happened, but I can tell you." She took me inside. "Now listen to me carefully," she said and began to explain. "One day AJ came and said she was having pains and was feeling uneasy. However, when she was leaving, she gave me more money than I expected and left. A few days later, your mother and her friends came. They suspected that AJ was having an affair with their husbands and wanted to cast a spell. They threatened to kill me if I didn't do what they said. Now we can't undo the spell. They chose this.